We really need to be suspicious of certainty wherever, what shape it takes. If we can learn to be more pliant and to learn from each other more, I think we would build a far more peaceful society.
Welcome to Point of Relation with Thomas Hübl, a podcast that illuminates the path to collective healing at the intersection of science and mysticism. This is the Point of Relation.
Abigail Disney is a philanthropist and social activist who works with organizations supporting peace building, gender justice, and systemic cultural change. She is an award-winning documentary filmmaker whose latest film is The American Dream and Other Fairy Tales.
Welcome to the Point of Relation. My name is Thomas Hübl, and I'm very excited to be sitting here with you, Abigail. Abigail Disney is joining us today, so very warm welcome here at the Point of Relation.
I'm excited to be here.
Yes, me too. I'm excited to be here with you, and I'm curious to learn from you. And first of all, what are you most passionate about now? And then maybe you can speak a little bit to like your journey that made you be passionate about what you're passionate about now, and that we can see a little bit your life trajectory leading up to this moment in your life and all you're doing now. So we can learn
a good question. That's a big question. So I think from even as a little child, I was very concerned with what was fair and what wasn't fair. That was just kind of an upset. I think because I was a middle child. The middle child, you pay a lot of attention to who's getting what and whatever. But I was conscious very young that we were well-resourced as a family and that something different was happening with us than with my friends and so forth. So I've had my eye on that all my life. And I left home. I went to college. I decided to go to graduate school at Columbia. And I found myself in the 1980s in New York City, in a city where the homelessness crisis was really out of hand. And I mean, I saw a person step over another person, to get to work. And that was a moment for me. I had a sense that things weren't right or fair, but where do you have to have fallen to be able to step over another human being? It just something was very wrong. And so I started a long journey into things like giving money to charities and then starting my own foundation and then volunteering for things, that kind of thing. And one thing led to another, and I have increasingly tried to figure out how to use the resources that I was given and the resources that I've developed over time to make the most difference, which is a very, mushy way of saying it. But in essence, it's about, bringing as much peace into the world as I possibly can and as much fairness into the world as I can. And so that led me to filmmaking, and I made a couple of films. And then a couple of years ago, some of the workers at Disneyland reached out to me, and my great uncle was Walt, my grandfather was Roy Disney. We went there a lot as kids, and I have such affectionate memories of being there with my grandfather. He was a lovely man. And one of the things he always said to us was, "Don't you dare disrespect those people who work at the park. They work so hard." And so that was really important to him. And everybody knew him by his first name, and he knew everybody else. And it was a really warm relationship. So in 2018, when I got an email or a message on Facebook from some of the workers saying, they won't even negotiate with us. We're making $11 an hour. I can't feed my family, those kinds of things. I knew enough about the world to know that was happening at almost every company. I had never wanted to go toward the family company as a way of this crusade of making things fair. It always felt too big and too scary for me to try to take on. But I had a long think about it. My first reaction was to tell him, well, I can't help you. There's nothing I can do. And I thought, well, that's not the most honest answer. And I had to admit to myself there wasn't nothing that I could do, and then aren't we all challenged in life to figure out if it's not nothing, then what is it? And I started to talk about it more publicly. First of all, in the context of the CEO's salary, which his compensation for that year was Now I'm forgetting the number, but it was $25 million or something crazy like that. And, it seemed like a good way to bring some focus on just how obviously, viscerally wrong this was. And when that started to get some traction, it felt like, well, okay, so let's talk about this. What do? I make films. So I started a film about it, and it came out in 2022 at the Sundance Film Festival. It was called The American Dream and Other Fairy Tales. And it was an attempt to kind of put together, Disney's such an interesting company because basically everything about American business is right there in that company. Everything, every labor problem, every copyright problem, everything. And they do so many different businesses. And then everything about Americans and what they think about themselves is there in that company too. Every fantasy we have, every fear we have. It feels like if you're going to talk about America and its super ego, that Disney is a perfect place to go. And so we tried to kind of weave a story together of, first of all, what happened at Disney, what I remember as opposed to what exists now, what is life like for workers there now, and then to weave it together with the story of American history and especially American corporate history in the way in the last 50 years it's radically changed, and has amounted to a massive change in the personality of the country we live in. I mean, I can remember it being a different country. That has kind of led me to where I am right now, which is to say, well, okay, you've looked at your family, and I've done as much as I could, and I'm proud to say they got up to $18 an hour and then a 42% raise from there. So I'm proud of that. But I've always known in the back of my mind that there was a story about my mother's side of the family that came from Louisiana, all the way back to the first white settlers there. And I had never let myself look at it before. And I feel like Americans, we give ourselves so much latitude not to look at things. We dedicate so much energy to not knowing things. And so I decided to start to have a look at that story. And of course, it's the story that, I wish weren't true. But of course, there were humans that were owned, bought and sold by my ancestors back through the generations. And it's, so the question is that I'm now kind of really circling around is like, what does that ask of me? What does that mean? Because, a lot of people dismiss that question right away. I mean, and, especially people in the South will say, well, that has nothing to do with me. I didn't do any of these things. I didn't buy and sell anybody. I haven't benefited by it. Those things are all true for me as well. But when your stomach kind of grabs hold, sometimes that this isn't nothing. And I've spent my life kind of benefiting in ways I never even tried to benefit by the relationship I have to this person that I barely knew. He died when I was 6. And it seems natural to people to like offer me credit for things I haven't done and think that I'm smarter than I am, laughed harder at my jokes. I've benefited by that in 1,000 different ways. Doesn't it stand to reason that I also need to take in the things that are negative and look at those as well? I can't do one thing and not the other. So that's what I'm kind of preoccupied with right now. And that's kind of led me to thinking about and studying this question of moral injury, which is, as I'm sure about it because you study trauma. It came from the study of trauma. It's not precisely trauma. But, I was raised in a home where racist things were said and done. And my mother was repeating what she'd been taught, and her mother was repeating what she had been taught. And I never knew where quite to put that. And I think there is a, obviously less intense version of moral injury that I think many of us carry. And the more we work to try to not see that, I think the more we take out of ourselves in terms of psychic and moral and intellectual and spiritual energy. So that's sort of how I want to take it on. I want to take it on as this question of, is moral injury like trauma collective, and is it transgenerational? If it is those things, then America has a lot to reckon with. all Americans have a lot to reckon with. We all live on stolen land. We all benefited by stolen labor. And the more we deny it, I think the further we get from any kind of peaceful society. I think a lot of our very toxic politics have to do with the fact that we're actually reaching a point where we can't swallow any more of these sins, the sin eaters at weddings. We've been eating sins for centuries. I think you can only eat so many. And then things start to go haywire. And I think a little bit that's what's happening to us in this moment.
I mean, you said so many so many important things right now in one go. I just want to highlight a few things. Like, first of all, it touches me how much it touches you, because I feel like the depth of your depth speaking also in, even if some of the things are things that you're still finding out, but deeper inside, I feel a strong drive that this is very important, and this reaches me, like the depth of your essence speaking here, and that these matters are important. And I think also when you spoke about the privilege, and that many of us have certain levels of privilege, we also have a responsibility. And I think when you spoke about looking and how much, and also let's stay now in like globally, but let's stay in the US society, like how much is being kind of invisible and not known as a defense to what you said, I think is true, that the moral injury, in my understanding, what I have seen in the intergenerational work, it's definitely intergenerational, and it's definitely we have much more work to do, and we need a different system in the society that we can process these things differently than we do it now. And you said another thing that I want to highlight is the less we look at it, the more chaos we will experience in the society. And I think all of these things are very, very wise, and I think should be heard by many, many people, because I think we really have to go and look voluntarily before we look when there is a massive crisis. And anyway, the crisis is already here. I mean, I think we are living in the crisis. And so, yeah, I love everything you just said. It's very powerful. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really going against the American grain right now, because if you look at the loudest voices in public life in this moment, they are the voices of pushing forward at all costs, an aggressive view of how interactions should occur. And so apologies are really not respected. They're not respected for the courage that real apologies take. And guilt is not thought of as an actual, real, visceral thing that is not a stupid thing to feel. And it's kind of a little stupid not to feel it for some things. And so like the outer world in our society, in this country right now, is so coarse, so hard, so unbending. And I really feel the need to at least make some space for the credibility that comes with bending, that the incredible gift it is to choose to bend.
Yes, I agree. I very much agree. And I think, like, collectively, we don't understand that if we slow down for a moment, if we create spaces to digest, if we reckon with our past, if we allow the changes in society that need to happen as a consequence. We cannot just reconcile the past and stay the same today. We're like, reconciling the past means we become somebody new that we all don't know. It's like not we are restoring backwards, we are restoring into a future that we don't know. And if we don't, I think, and then we see, wow, actually what we were afraid of, that we will lose something, the opposite's gonna happen. We will actually all win when we restore our past. But if we don't do it, we will actually more and more go into a downward spiral.
Beyonce, being a very wise woman, has a line at the beginning of American Requiem, which is, for everything to stay the same, it needs to change again. And I think that's a really beautiful place to start a song with a name like American Requiem, because there's so much about mourning in American life right in this moment, and especially African American people know this better than anyone. And the idea that we are grasping so tightly to what is currently true, and even squeezing with all our might to hold it where it is. And the harder you squeeze history, the more it oozes between your fingers, and so you're watching it happen in places like Florida, where they've made it illegal to talk about race history in the classrooms when there's enormous history to be studied and benefited by. It's amazing that guilt is dismissed as sort of a weak emotion when they're fighting so hard so that nobody ever feels it. That feels to me like a little bit of a confession of how powerful and how much it asks of you. The fear is of guilt and the recognition.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Again, I agree completely. And I have taken thousands of people into reconciliation processes with their past in different cultural fields. And every time we did it, even if it's not easy, even if it's, we go through difficult emotions and difficult processes, but at the end of the day, it feels like you're closer to yourself, you're more intimate with yourself in life, and you have better relationships, and you feel that you reconciled something and you grew, you matured. And I think that's exactly what we need now. We need more mature societies to strengthen our democracies. And I don't think there's any way without reconciling the past, because that fragmentation, and look, when you look at social media at the moment, like how much fragmentation, how much war, like war is going on.
Yeah, the more we fragment, the more war and violence in general feels like the only answer to every question.
Right.
If we could actually look at the Middle East and see, oh my gosh, we're basically the same people, with a shared history. It's that's very simplistic. I understand, but even at the same time, we are solving every problem with a hammer, and we have so many more tools if we would stop to take stock.
In your own experience, when you started to look at your own family history, how do you want to speak a little bit about how you experienced it, and what's the learning maybe that came out of them?
I was in Selma, Alabama, on a trip with a group of church people, and we were just sort of experimenting with the idea that we could do reconciliation trips across the South with conservatives and liberals and so forth. And I had never been to Selma before. It's a really extraordinary place of pain. It's not a place where that redemptive story dominates at all. That was one afternoon, and the rest of history in Selma has been just damaging and ugly. As in one example, it was 1965, the march in Selma. The mayor in 1965 was still the mayor in 2000. That is how long that same guy and that same sheriff were in charge in this place, where when you speak to Americans about Selma, they kind of get a little misty-eyed and think of it as this great victory. But it's this forgotten place. Anyway, so I was going through this experience that this woman had set up, because it was a big slave trading outpost, as well as a lot of other things before the Civil War. And she had created this experience of what it would have been like to be on a slave ship. So it's in this extremely dark room, and you're in there with strangers and getting pushed together and so forth. It was hard. And I came out of there, and my phone rang as soon as I came out of there. And I had sent a question to my cousin, who does a lot of the research about the family, about like, what was the name of the town and how many people were owned. And that was when she called me when I came out of there. She said, this is Delisle, Mississippi. And in the last census, there were about 24 people. And they weren't people with names. They were people with genders and ages, and that's all. The 1850 census had about 12 people, so more people had been added. So, to say that I experienced it in my body is to say it very lightly. And, it just came with me, and I carry it with me still. It feels, I don't know. I keep running up against this space of no language. when I try to describe why it feels so important to look at it squarely. It just feels like I'm not living my purpose in life unless I really tell myself and the people around me truth about what was happening there.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And you said it because many people might think, oh, it's my body is like a separate entity, but actually our body is a whole context of ancestors. And when there are some ethical transgressions, we feel we cannot be embodied and live our full purpose without restoring what lives deeply in the soil of our bodies. Our bodies know, and that's what you said. Like I felt it very strongly in my body, and I think, and I have heard this thousands of times, the same sentence, and so that's very powerful.
I've always carried everything in my stomach. I don't know why, just always in my stomach. And so when I'm not feeling well, when I'm happy, it's in my stomach. Either one. My cousin, who's done a lot of this research, had started just sort of inspecting who had skin cancer in the family because she had skin cancer that she was fighting. And she went all the way back to this great, however many greats, grandfather in Alabama, whose daughter married the guy who was living in Mississippi. And he was the most notorious slave owner in Alabama. He was just awful and famously evil. And he had skin cancer so badly that his entire cheek had been cut off, so that he had this face. And I mean, if William Faulkner had written it, you would say, oh, come on, Bill, you're like taking it a little too far there, because the vividness and the reality of the way the body, is reflecting the damage, the horror, the evil, the toxicity of what was going on, which is not to say that people with skin cancer deserve what they get. But the visual image of him had to have been horrifying to the people he was buying and selling. He must have been terrifying. And it felt like a scene from a Faulkner novel.
Mm. Yeah, it's important what you just said also, that not everybody who has some health issues, that's the reason. And obviously our bodies are very sensitive, biocomputers, and we carry a lot of our history. History is not gone. This, like, unintegrated history is the past that travels with us, and you described it beautifully. And so how does this inform you today? First of all, I think it's very courageous that you do this at all, because many people, don't have the courage to look. And so you started, okay, even if it's uncomfortable, even if I don't know what I'm going to find, I will look. And so how does this inform you today?
I feel like we must all look at our lives and ask ourselves, are we uniquely placed? Is there some way in which I'm uniquely placed? And I feel very uniquely placed because I've been so advantaged and so forth. But not just in that sense. I feel like I had an inside view of the way people in certain ways of life think. As an example, I can remember my mother standing over me at 9 years old when I was reading my history textbook and objecting to the way that the slave owners were being described in my history book. And she said, well, as Yankees, they always lie to you. That most of the slave owners were very nice to their slaves. And when at the end of the war, they wanted to stay with their owners because, this is classic lost cause ideology. But she was passing it along to me as truth, and a bigger truth and better truth than what was being told to me by my history textbook. That is, I think, part of the mechanism by which moral injury gets passed. It gets passed through lore and belief and so forth. I'm reading Isabel Wilkerson's book about caste right now, which is a beautiful book. And the way she speaks from the inside of the experience of being of this reviled caste, it came to me that I know the inside of the experience of the other caste. I know what it sounds like inside of one of these families. I know what it looks like in terms of the way people treat each other and behave. And I'm not interested in telling a horrible expose kind of story. Actually, kind of the story I want to arrive at is, I love my mother. I loved her. She was a really wonderful, funny, fabulous person who also did these things. It wasn't her essence. And maybe there are people for whom that's their essence, but I think the large majority of even people doing the worst things, that's not who they are. And so I was raised on a lot of those kinds of moments where, as a child, I remember looking at my mother that day and saying, but Mom, they were slaves. And so I got it, which I'm proud of at 9. I was able to have the wherewithal to push back and to say that and to see that, because not everybody can. So I'm proud of that. But, you know, I've heard so much worse. And what I feel like is I don't know where to store that. I mean, my grandmother especially said some horrible, horrible things as I was growing up. And even as a child, I would feel myself go, like that. It was like, whoa, that was so hateful. And she was wonderful. Also, she took such good care of my grandfather when he had a stroke. She took care of him until the day he died. And she was loyal, and she was kind, and she was funny. So I'm trying to figure out how do I arrange myself around, like, I need to hold these truths. I need to hold them. I will not let them go because they are true. But I also need to hold that I loved my grandmother and I loved my mother, and these things can exist both at the same time. I have a unique view of it because a couple of times I've been public criticizing my Uncle Walt. There's a well-documented history of racism and anti-Semitism. It's like, I can't even believe I have to explain to people that it exists, but just go see Song of the South. That's all you need to know. So anyway, I won't make that argument, but in the times that I have criticized him publicly, the blowback I've gotten from complete strangers, people who never met him, didn't know anything about him, just fans, has been shocking. I mean, it's really people calling me names, horrible names, and just telling me I should burn in hell. I mean, really the worst kind of internet trolling in defense of this guy. So why? The question is why? And I think it's because most people feel that what I'm actually saying is you should hate yourself, because I'm telling you to hate Walt. And if you loved Walt, then you loved what he did and you enjoyed all the things that he made, then you should hate yourself. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, look at it. Look at it for what it really is. Nobody's telling you can't enjoy The Jungle Book. But at the same time, I mean, Baloo is funny and they're all funny, but it was from some of the most racist source material he ever used from Rudyard Kipling. And there is a deep message in there that people should stay with their own kind. And he made it in the middle of the 60s during the height of the civil rights movement. It's really hard for me to pretend that all of that isn't contained in Jungle Book, even if it's a very enjoyable film. And I've had African-American people say to me, don't diss Walt. We love Walt. You can't criticize him for this, because they don't know what to do with that either. So I feel like I've been wrestling with this for so long, this question of what do we do with the hateful things that are inside of every one of our histories. How do we own them? How do we tell ourselves the truth about them and still contain love and acceptance of the people who bring it into our lives?
Yeah, that's very interesting. First of all, it's very fascinating to listen to you and to also the complexity of your life story. I think it's very, very interesting. And what touches me is your willingness to keep going and to keep going deeper. This feels very resonant in me. I can feel it very much I want to go to the root of this. And of course, it's step by step, but I feel you're very committed to that movement. And you said something very interesting, because light and dark, or good and evil, are like, when we polarize into shadow, it's like it needs to be either one or the other. And then, but that's very dangerous, because that's where we exactly create these posters of life, these 2D posters that we try to feel safe in. It's much more challenging to say, wow, I feel love, and there was a lot of hatred. It's like, that's much more challenging, and it needs much more maturity to host this in oneself and not try to polarize the tension. Because if you cannot be with the tension, you need to identify yourself with a pole. Either I'm on this side or on this side. But if you have enough consciousness to host the tension and you don't need to reject it, you say, yes, this feels like a tension in me. And all of this is part of life. And it doesn't mean that when I say there is love, I agree to the hatred. It's like that a mature perspective can host contradiction and work with it. And I think that's so important. And that's what you also described about your fans, because then it sounds like, oh, you are telling them in the less mature perspective, it sounds like you're telling them to hate themselves for all this stuff, but that's not what you're saying. But that's also what a mature perspective wouldn't hear.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's this like visceral response. And I think what Walt offered in the things that he made was an image of America back to itself. And it was a very benign, benevolent image of America. And people loved that story. And what he offered people also were these polar choices. The bad guys are always very clearly bad guys, and there's no complexity to them. And how many bad guys are really like that? That's a standard Hollywood thing. They give us the Nazi and the Boer and the Southern white supremacist, and they're always the same. In the movie The Help, the woman who's a white supremacist, she's bad because she also treats her children badly, and she also does all these other things. So that the idea is that she just carries evil with her in every single way, and that's just not the way it works. But you use this language 2D, which is interesting to me because that's how I'm thinking of it. I think that because I'm very interested in these stories of people who turn out to have been much more complicated than we thought. So, George Washington turns out to be a terrible, terrible slave owner who did a lot of cool things. I think it's interesting that Florence Nightingale, we think of as this benign nurse who was nice and everything, what she went through to go to Crimea and to deal with the soldiers was basically the nurses at that time they were called camp followers, and they were basically prostitutes. And she risked, her status, say what you want about wanting that status, but as a lady in society to do the benign thing. And so she's thought of as this kind of obvious person. So when Henry Dunant, who was a very good friend, proposed the formation of the International Red Cross, she opposed him. And she opposed because she wanted the soldiers to be treated and she wanted the hungry to be fed. But she said, if you form an agency that feeds and takes care of people, then there's going to be no reason for any government to ever stop doing this. And it's just going to get worse. And I think of that as such a morally sophisticated, complex thinking piece of decision making that she had. And we think of her as this like nice lady. And I call it the IKEA effect, because like you go to IKEA, you buy a bookshelf, and a bookshelf is shaped like this in the real world, but you get this flat box. And that's what we do when people die, was we just unfold them and put them back in that flat box so that they fit on the shelf just right. They don't stick out in any inconvenient ways. They don't ask you any questions. And we've done it like Helen Keller, who was a fierce anti-war activist and a very feisty left-wing socialist. Everybody thinks of her as this kind of nice old lady, who was blind and deaf. And the minute she started speaking up, people said, oh, she doesn't know what she's talking about. She's just being led astray by her nurse. And I think it's a big problem that we have in America, of a particular form of emotional immaturity that is not exclusive to Americans, but it does characterize our public life.
Yeah, I'm very happy we're speaking about this, or like what it takes to host this complexity, to let these contradictions or let these tensions within people, within communities, like coexist, because that's much more challenging also to our ethical maturity than if we can say, okay, this is good and this is bad. And it's much easier because it doesn't require a relationship. But what we are talking about requires much more relationship. You need to be much more related and grounded in yourself, because relationship doesn't mean that you agree to these things. The opposite. You can be very clearly opposing certain values or certain actions or certain whatever aspects, but you are not disrelated. And then I think we are also much more effective in changing our society versus creating this kind of boxes, and then we cannot talk to each other, and that's why we cannot transform.
Right. If you look at the primary political and social polarizations in this country, it really is between people who really are in flight from complexity, and on both sides. And they're really looking for the world to be divided up into two types of people, which we know there are two types of people: the people who think there are two types of people, and then people who know it's complicated. And increasingly, for instance, when Florida says you can't teach this kind of history, what they're looking to do is to close off all the escape valves and the escape hatches, so that then we're all walking the same straight line together, and it feels very clear. And it's a flight from reality, yes, but it's also this terrible narrowing, and it's an atrophy of this muscle we all need, which is the muscle that holds complexity. And the more you use it, the better it becomes and the stronger it becomes. And I mean, I don't know how to live in that kind of narrow binary world. It's a very inhospitable place. And so I think that's part of the reason why trans issues, for instance, are so important right now in the public life, because feminists have always been sort of pushing in the direction of, can we please take off the strictures on gender roles? Even if they weren't necessarily talking about trans issues, they were attacking the gender binary. And so it could only have taken us to this place logically. So yeah, what would happen if there were no gender binary? Would we all fall apart and die? Or would we just take each person at what they present themselves to us to be? And why do we need to know more than that, in the short term? So I think one of the reasons that's really getting under the skin of the right wing in this country is because it goes against everything, that they really need to believe, which is that the world is easily divided into two categories in 100 different ways.
Yeah, and it also confronts, of course, on the one hand, some spiritual concepts, and it also confronts us with our own inability to be related to us. Like all the parts where I'm not at home in myself, I need to kind of make more strict or rigid in the world, or they are more chaotic. But when we know from trauma, either it becomes very rigid or it becomes chaotic and disorganized. And I think what we see is like and also what you said about like restricting history, these kind of things never last. We cannot suppress. Yeah, it will last for some time, but it will have to break open, and then the only choice is a crisis, a major disruption, more pain, because we can't clean the past that is very painful. That doesn't work. And I think we throw enough painkillers on discomfort and try to keep our cities clean, and all the rest is somewhere where we don't see it. I mean, this doesn't work. We know this. And so I think what you're talking about is so important. How can we motivate our culture? And I think very strongly that we need to create an architecture in the country or in countries around the world where we have a mainstream architecture. Like there are hospitals, we call it the medical system, and that's where you get medical care. But we need another kind of architecture that is the collective integration process of the legacy of every nation. And then US has its own, Germany has its own, Latin America has its own legacy, but we need a system where we can, process that as a citizen's responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah.
And without that, I think we keep repeating all this fragmentation, as you said.
Well, that's why the economic damage over the last 50 years of everything that started in the 70s and then with the Reagan administration, it feels like I'm just talking about like mundane politics. But actually, what happened over that time was the takeover, the absolute capture of the imagination of this country by the idea that we're all individuals. That's what's underneath every single piece of damaging legislation and corporate ideology that we're now reaping the whirlwind from now. And the idea that you pull yourself up by your bootstraps is comedy. Actually, try it. You can't do it. It can't be done. And in the 19th century, it was an expression that was used to define something that was impossible to do. So it is it's frightening to me how much we've managed to sell people this notion that they're alone. And it's why one of the reasons moral injury is such an important thing to study, because the only thing that seems to help, because there's no medicine, there's no specific therapy. The only things that help are working in groups and talking spiritually. I mean, for the Pentagon, of all places, to acknowledge there's such a thing as moral injury and to hand it to the chaplain corps. The chaplain corps. This is, the Pentagon we're talking about. This is the most, left-brained, rational thinking thing in the world. For them to say chaplains were out of ideas and the suicide rate is so bad, we really need to talk about this. That is like the Pentagon saying that war is a spiritual problem.
Which it is.
That should have been a seismic moment, when they decided to do this, because that really is like the least spiritual entity acknowledging that there's such a thing as spirituality, that it exists. And what's really interesting these days about moral injury is they're doing fMRI studies now that show it showing up in a totally different part of the brain. Have you read about this? It's very interesting. So it shows up in the precuneus, which is the part of your brain that's in charge of sort of remembering the things that have happened, recalling episodic memories, putting together for you the story of your life, your identity, who you are. I can't think of a better word than conscious. We lost in the last 20 years, a little over 8,000 people to combat, but we lost over 30,000 people to suicide. That's an astonishing number. And that should scare the life out of all of us in terms of what it is we think we're doing as a country.
Yeah, and I also think I say this often in my talks also, I think the way we deal with war is actually, first of all, is part of the hypnosis of the individual that you spoke about, because there's such an overemphasis on individual, which I think if there are many people in our society that live in pain because of the system that we created, then being open to that and feeling interdependence is almost not possible, because we need to protect ourselves to not feel what we're actually creating every day. So that's, I think, one element of this hyper-individualism. And the other one is, when you look at armies, I often say, I think our societies do not understand that the weight of war doesn't rest just with the soldiers. It rests with every single citizen of the country. So if the army goes to war, the residue needs to be carried by everybody. But we don't have those. We don't have any rituals. We don't have any awareness process, like how war affects the entire society of a country. And because we don't have that, it gets compressed into the people that were actually in combat or that actually suffered a moral injury. And that is completely out of balance. I think that the wars are collective events that affect collectives. And we need a much deeper understanding of that. And that will relieve some of the suicidality, because it actually becomes like a shared responsibility. But the other side of it would be, we would all stand up much more and say, no, that war is not going to happen, because we know what's the impact. So I think peace is an outcome of a collective understanding of war.
Yeah. And a lot of the people I talk to who deal a lot in moral injury describe veteran moral injury as a terrible and unjust allocation of the appropriate level of guilt for what's happening.
Exactly.
And this is true for people who work in slaughterhouses and people who do all kinds of other morally injurious jobs. We just look the other way and say, take care of that for me. But we are asking them to carry so much. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is such a fascinating character for me, because when he was arrested, it was because he had willingly decided to become part of a plot to assassinate Hitler. And for me, knowing what a Christian he was and how committed to nonviolence he was, and what a pacifist he was, I feel like there's no greater sacrifice I can imagine than stepping into what would sincerely feel to him like throwing his eternal soul away, because that's what it would have been for him to kill Hitler, even Hitler. And what an extraordinary act of love it would be to offer up your eternal soul for everyone else. And that is an appropriate way of understanding the moral injury of one act. That is him understanding the gravity of it. I was in North Korea a few years ago on a peace mission with a bunch of women activists. It was fascinating. We had a meeting in North Korea with a bunch of women who were still alive and had survived the Korean conflict. And of course, the Americans were in the North doing what all soldiers do in all conflicts. It's not Americans are particularly bad, but they're no better than any other army attempting to occupy a space. And so, I've been in a million of these circles because I've traveled to conflict zones and spoke with women. And so these women set up a circle and they told us about this horrible thing that happened and that horrible thing happened and so forth. And I couldn't shake the feeling something was really interesting about this. And then it came to me that, oh my gosh, this war was in the late 40s, early 50s, and it's alive for them. It's still alive. Try coming to this country and asking an American what happened in the Korean War. We've been at war almost nonstop since that day. It's not alive for us in any of these conflicts. We're not holding the reality of these conflicts. And it is so much to our peril that we pretend that nothing is happening.
I love this. I mean, Abigail, I see our time, so we'll slowly come to an end. But I would love maybe to have a second part.
I would love that. I mean, the time has just flown by.
It's just, yeah, right. It's like boom, and almost an hour passed. And because I think there are so many sub-aspects of what you spoke about, and especially to dive deeper into the moral injury. I would love that, and also seeing what are restoration or repair processes and what's the spiritual dimension, maybe to talk more about what you just said, the unconscious denial of the war memories in our societies. And I think there's so much more to talk about, but it needs a little bit more space. So I would love that. If there's anything that you want to leave us with.
I think we should always leave room for the possibility that we might be wrong in whatever it is. And certainty is the enemy here. We really need to be suspicious of certainty what shape it takes. If we can learn to be more pliant and to learn from each other more, I think we would build a far more peaceful society.
That is beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a real joy. And I feel there's so much more coming through us, both of us, in the conversation. So we should definitely continue. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Point of Relation with Thomas Hübl. Stay connected and get updates about new episodes by visiting our website, pointofrelationpodcast.com, and by subscribing to the Thomas Hübl YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share about us with your community on social media. Thank you. We appreciate your support.